side, it seems the podcast will be working. Okay. Well, welcome in the Wyberen van Haga, Scott Ritter. This is, I think, a very special first time that we're going to be together. Scott, I don't know, I don't remember any video that you said with a sitting politician in a video. I'm very glad, Wyberen van Haga, that you can be here. I want to introduce for the people in the United States and for the Dutch, you both. Wyberen van Haga has been a Dutch politician in the Dutch parliament since 2017. And he has been a commando in the Dutch army. He has his own businesses, as far as I know. You have some criticism about the rhetoric, the war rhetoric against Russia in the Dutch government. The Dutch political party Groep van Haga has 3 seats in parliament. You have been labeled by politician Dylan Yesilgos Zegerius as a malodorous lard. Malodorous lard. Maybe, Scott, you can pronounce this word. It's in Dutch een onwelriekende reuzel genoemd. It's somebody broke into your house a month ago. You are actually under attack. The rhetoric that's being used against you as a politician makes people wanting to break into your house and threaten you.
Yeah, it's really weird. We're getting threats every week, and nothing really has been done with it. And it's gone that far that the Minister of Justice actually called me an extreme right-winged, stinking pig grease or something. But it's all rhetoric, and it's all it's all the same monotonous sounds, and basically it's not only the war in Ukraine; it's just a big collectivistic takeover.
It is, and they try to assassinate our characters everywhere just to get to win the argument. In the time that Saddam Hussein was accused to have weapons of mass destruction, and he was supposed to work together with Osama bin Laden. It was after the 9/11 attacks, and America thought it was the right thing to start a war on terror, which destroyed Iraq. Scott Ritter has been in the Senate debating, argumenting that there was no weapons of mass destruction, and Joe Biden, in a younger form, has told him that it was beyond his pay grade to decide what the government had to do about Saddam Hussein. He's been labeled as an information terrorist. There is a hit list on the Ukrainian government side with there's many people on this list. I think there was even addresses of these people. People are being assassinated that are on the list. So this is Scott Ritter. Scott, welcome to this podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
If I say anything that is incorrect, please correct me. It's I try to do my investigation in this whole subject as good as I can. So we are going to talk a little bit about the war in Ukraine. This is one of the main subject in your podcast and everywhere where you're invited as a speaker, Scott. Because the narrative that's on the Dutch television or the television everywhere in the West is that Russia is an aggressive force that is invading a country without any sound reason. And this is what I have a problem with all the news. They leave a lot of context out of this situation. The war didn't start 9 months ago, but almost 9 years ago. Could you tell the Dutch people a little bit about this, Scott?
Well, you're absolutely right. Nothing can be evaluated in a vacuum. And, the fact of the matter is not only did Russia articulate a legally cognizable justification for their military intervention, the so-called special military operation that was initiated on February 24th under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Let me just throw that out to your Dutch audience. Russia articulated a legally sound defense of their decision to intervene militarily in Ukraine under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Now, before you say, well, that's just the Russians making stuff up, I'd like to ask the Dutch people to reflect on the argument made by their government within the context of their membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, justifying NATO military intervention into Serbia in 1999. Because if you think that was legal, if you think you were on the right side of history, then you can have absolutely no objection to what Russia did, because Russia used the exact same legal formulation with one major exception. When you say that you're carrying out preemptive self-defense, there needs to be an imminent threat worthy of that intervention. In Russia's case, this was the massing of tens of thousands of NATO-trained Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine who were planning an imminent assault on the Donbas region. In the case of NATO's intervention against Serbia, it was a manufactured case of allegations about genocide that simply were not true. So the Dutch people need to reflect on the fact that you violated the sovereignty of Serbia using a lie. Russia has defended the interests of Russia and the Donbass based upon the truth. Russia's on the right side of history on this one. You can be critical of Russia. I am often critical of Russia. No nation is perfect. Nations make mistakes. But when it comes to Ukraine, Russia has been on the right side of history. Russia didn't start the 2014 Maidan coup. Russia actually was working with the government of Viktor Yanukovych to try and create some sort of economic normalization between Russia and Ukraine after a decision was made that Ukraine was not going to move forward and try to achieve the similar thing with the European Union. This action by Viktor Yanukovych threatened the plans of the European Union and the United States, who wanted to use an economic union as the beginning of stripping Ukraine away from the Russian sphere of influence. This actually began in 2008 when NATO extended an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO. This expansion of NATO, which, by the way, if we go back to 1990, NATO promised then President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union there would be no expansion, not 1 inch eastward, we were told. Not just once, several times, not just from James Baker to Edward Shevardnadze, but all the NATO ministers to their Soviet counterparts. NATO lied, simply lied. And the expansion of NATO was seen in the context that Russia was told it's not a threat. Don't worry. NATO's a defensive alliance. And then NATO carried out an offensive war of aggression, unprovoked, against Serbia, a Slavic nation. So the Russians are looking at NATO expansion up to their borders. When NATO allowed the 3 Baltic states in, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, they did so deliberately excluding the armed forces of these 3 Baltic states who have a shared border with Russia from the context of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, which was supposed to manage the size of the militaries in Europe in an effort to deconflict. What NATO did is said, no, we're going to increase our side, but because these nations weren't part of that agreement, they're not going to be part of it, thereby allowing a major military buildup on Russia's borders near St. Petersburg, a major Russian city. The Russians said this is absurd. This is part of that aggressive expansion. So when you look at the aggressive expansion of NATO, part of a policy of stripping Ukraine away to weaken Russia, then you link that to a coup, which replaces a pro-Russian president, democratically elected, by the way, with radical ultra-right-wing, white supremacist, neo-Nazi affiliated thugs who then carry out a program of targeted genocide against the Russians. Not theoretical genocide, not manufactured genocide. This isn't the CIA working with the Kosovo Liberation Army to create a manufactured case against the Serbian government. This is neo-Nazis jamming a building full of Russians and setting it on fire and clapping and cheering as 48 people burned to death, died of smoke inhalation, were shot trying to escape, or died jumping out of the building because the flames were going to burn them to death. This is what we're dealing with in Ukraine. Then we have an 8-year war of aggression waged by these Nazis and the Ukrainian government against the innocent people of the Donbass. You know, it got so bad that the former Ukrainian president, Peter Poroshenko, gave a speech. And he said, Ukrainian children are going to be able to walk to kindergarten every day, but the children of the Donbass will be cowering in their basements because we will be shelling them. Hey, NATO, that's who you're aligning with? And you know what else Poroshenko said? He said that the Minsk agreement, which was put together in 2015 by what they called the Normandy format, the Netherlands' wonderful allies, Germany and France, came together to create the opportunity for peace. Russia was part of this process. Ukraine signed on to this process, but from 2015 to 2022, it was never implemented. You may ask yourself why. The West says it's because Russia interfered. Russia did no such thing. Russia was always asking, demanding that Minsk be signed in. Who interfered? NATO and Ukraine. Why? Again, Poroshenko, the former president of Ukraine, Minsk was a sham, he said, a sham. We did it to create time so that we could build a Ukrainian military using NATO training so that we could launch an assault to liberate the Donbass from the ethnic Russian separatists and Crimea from the Russians. So when people say, well, Russia was fabricating this case that there was an imminent threat, Poroshenko acknowledged that was the intent. In 2019, the person that took over from Poroshenko, Zelensky, held a meeting with his senior advisors where he said, we are going to war in the Donbass. We are going to attack them. We are going to attack them. It's not theoretical, ladies and gentlemen. The war in Ukraine began long before Russia carried out an act of preemptive self-defense by moving into Ukraine to eliminate the threat to the Russian people of the Donbass and to Russia writ large. The policies of the Ukrainian government, if you remove the term Russian and you insert the term Jew, are the exact same policies that Nazi Germany embraced in the 1930s, seeking to remove a class of people, an ethnic race, a religious affiliated people from the earth. The Ukrainians now treat the Russians like the Germans treated the Jews. And if you're okay with that, you got a problem with me, I'll tell you that much.
Wyberen, what do you say? What do you have to say about this?
Well, I think at the end of the day, our prime interest is to have peace there. And of course, this Russian invasion, which we condemned, was an escalation, or a step on the escalation ladder. And it is horrible that it happened. But what surprises me is how the Dutch government reacted, and in a way that was so forceful and so warmongering. Our Prime Minister Rutte, he even stood in front of a Ukrainian flag and shouted out the Second World War. Sort of, what did he say? Slava Ukraini, and which was used in the Second World War by the Ukrainians, and it's very weird that our Prime Minister actually participates in a war that is definitely not ours, and so I really completely fail to understand what the interest is of the West, and especially because we're only getting one side of the story. Our news only brings Ukrainian victories, and in the end of the day, I don't care too much. I think it's not our war. I think we've shot ourselves in the foot by imposing all these sanctions, and I'm really worried about what's happening now. The Ukrainians are obviously winning, according to our press. So that's really what I would like to know from Scott. We've got these battlegrounds in Crimea where the 155th Marine Brigade apparently has been butchered. 50% has been lost. Then we've got the Kakhovka Dam, which has been blown to pieces by the Russians, apparently. There's the P-66 highway battleground. I'm wondering, why are the Russians not winning, as you've been predicting? And what is the end game? What's the timeline now?
Let's start with the beginning. The special military operation was initiated with approximately 200,000 troops. And I think most military observers believed one of two things. One, that the Russians would come in doctrinally, meaning using the full destructive capacity of their armed forces and steamroll over the Ukrainian military. And I believed that. I committed to that. So did the director of the CIA. So did the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So did the NATO Military Committee. So did every major military professional in the world. The briefing given to the President of the United States is that that Kiev would fall within 72 hours, and that Ukraine would capitulate within a week. And that probably could have happened had the Russians come in doctrinally, meaning kill everything in front of you. But they didn't, and it surprised everybody. Russia instead took an approach of trying to advance as rapidly as possible to create the inevitability of victory, the perception that would then cause the Ukrainian government to collapse and surrender. Why did they do this? I think this is one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern history. I think the Russian government had been told by their intelligence services that the Ukrainian military was going to stay in the barracks and that most Ukrainian civil authorities would open up the gates and prevent resistance. And we saw in some places this did happen. That's how Russia was able to take Kherson early on in the war. That's how Russia was able to achieve the land bridge linking Crimea through Zaporizhia into Donetsk. But in other areas, it didn't happen. For instance, the move out of Belarus towards Kiev, there was heavy resistance. Out of Sumy towards Kiev, heavy resistance. And the Russians found themselves in a situation where they were engaged in a serious war that they hadn't anticipated. And now they had to adjust. And that's what we saw on March 25th, where the Russians adjusted and they withdrew from the Kiev area, brought the forces back down and focused solely on taking the Donbass, liberating the Donbass, Lugansk and Donetsk. Now, many people call this a Ukrainian victory. And indeed, it probably could be called a Ukrainian victory. I believe that there was an element of the Russian action once they failed to take Kiev that was designed to shape the battlefield, to freeze Ukrainian military resources in place, to create a military advantage on the Eastern Front. And then once Russia began to fight, they began to grind down the Ukrainian military. We're talking about casualty ratios of 10 to 15 to 1. That is, for every 10 to 15 Ukrainian soldiers killed or wounded, one Russian soldier was killed or wounded. And if you don't think that's a Russian victory, I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. When you're killing that many of the enemy, to you, you're grinding down. And the fact of the matter is, the Ukrainian military that existed in February of 2022 was largely destroyed by June and July of this summer. And the war could have been over by this summer, except that in May, NATO and the United States began providing tens of billions of dollars worth of military aid and financial assistance to prop up the Ukrainian government. And this was what I called at the time a game changer, because the Ukrainian army was able to reconstitute itself in significant numbers with modern equipment and trained by NATO, given intelligence support by NATO, communication support by NATO, operational planning support by NATO. In effect, this new Ukrainian military was a NATO army. It just didn't fight under the NATO flag. Ukraine is a nation of 44 million people. So certainly they'll be able to mobilize sufficient manpower The problem is it trained manpower. You say NATO hasn't provided troops, and I agree. But there are thousands of mercenaries from NATO countries who are fighting in Ukraine. Are they doing this with the permission of their nations? I always thought that being a mercenary was an illegal activity. But there's something going on in NATO that facilitates the recruitment, training, and transfer of highly qualified military personnel under the guise of private military contractors to Ukraine to carry out fighting on the front line. So if you're speaking French, if you're speaking English, if you're speaking German, Dutch, or any other European language and you're fighting in Europe, you're a NATO army because NATO knows about it. NATO's training you. NATO's equipping you. Plus, there are thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Polish troops and Romanian troops fighting in Ukraine, wearing Ukrainian uniforms, but they're not Ukrainian soldiers. So those are NATO countries. So the idea that NATO isn't fighting in Ukraine is an absurdity. Of course it's fighting in Ukraine. They're just not doing it under the NATO flag. And this new army, this NATO army, primarily Ukrainian manpower, but with significant numbers of mercenaries, Polish and Romanian forces, carried out an offensive operation starting in September against the Russians, who still only had 200,000 troops. They were inadequate to the task. You can't defend a 1,000-kilometer front line with, when we say 200,000 troops, remember only about 60,000 of them are committed to combat operations. That's 60 men per kilometer of frontage. You were in the military. Is that sufficient? And the answer is no, of course not. You can't defend a kilometer of frontage with 60 men. And the end result was the Ukrainians had impressive advances. The Russians withdrew, trading territory to save lives, consolidating their defenses. And they're still in the process of consolidating their defenses. But in the process, they have slaughtered the Ukrainians. Again, history teaches something. Pyrrhus, the Greek emperor fighting the Romans in the Pyrrhic Wars, would win battles, but he'd win them at a cost that could not be replenished, whereas the Romans could replenish their losses. And ultimately, Pyrrhus was defeated. It's the same thing that happened in the American Civil War between Grant and Lee. For 1864, General Grant launched a number of attacks against the Confederates. The Confederates killed a whole bunch of Union troops, but didn't have sufficient forces to replace their casualties, and they lost. And Russia's mobilizing around. This is what people forget. In the month of October alone, Ukraine lost 12,000 people in Kherson. Russia lost 1,500. Ukraine right now is working with NATO, the European Union, to train up between 20 and 40,000 troops and get them equipped by sometime later this winter in the spring. 40,000. Let's give them maximum benefit. 40,000. By the end of December, Russia will complete its mobilization of 300,000. 80,000 have already been committed to the front to stabilize it. 200,000, that's 10 to 15 divisions, are going to be arriving on the front lines. And Ukraine has nothing to respond to that. Nothing. You think Russia's losing? Russia hasn't even begun the fight yet. Russia's always been fighting with one arm behind its back. Russia just began carrying out a systemic destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure. You think Ukraine's going to have a comfortable winter? No. They're going to be cold. There's going to be no power. The retreat in Kherson was what any military professional does when your troops are in a difficult position. The terrain was not favorable. You know, how do I describe it? In the month leading up to the withdrawal from Kherson, Russia inflicted 12,000 casualties on the Ukrainians at a loss of 1,500. It's a Russian victory. The problem is the Russians actually care about their men and realize that they were going to stay in this indefensible position. While they may kill a lot of Ukrainians, they're going to suffer a lot of casualties themselves. So rather than losing men for a piece of territory that is meaningless, you pull back to more defensible positions and wait until the 10 to 15 divisions arrive at the front. That's the important factor, not giving up some territory in Kherson when 15 divisions of fresh troops, well-trained equipped show up on the front lines in late December, early January, that's when we will see how this war. Right now, Russia is simply buying time. I don't know if you'll cross the river. That's a very difficult defensive position. What I predict is they're going to exploit the victories that Russia is having today in the Bakhmut region, in Donetsk, where Russia has been advancing, destroying Ukrainian defenses. Nobody talks about this, what's going on right now. The Russians have penetrated these defenses, and they're in the position of rolling them up. And you commit 10 divisions there, 5 divisions, whatever, you now can sweep up towards Kharkov. You can head down towards Kherson. You don't need to carry a frontal assault against Kherson. You can flank it from the rear. That's what I think Russia is going to do. And there's nothing the Ukrainians have that can stop Russia from doing this.
Victoria Nuland has been quite vocal for years about spending $5 billion into Ukraine.
That's when we will see how this works. Right now,
So,
Russia
so when the 10 to 15 divisions will arrive, you predict that they will cross the river again and take Kherson back.
The feeling about the people and move the industry was supporting to Russia, and they wanted to change the narrative in the West, everywhere. But when we do this in Ukraine or any other country, this is okay. We promise these people money. The IMF is giving them loads of money. These people
can flank it from the rear. That's what I think Russia is going to do. And there's nothing the Ukrainians have that can stop Russia from doing this.
Scott, and also Wyberen, I would like to talk about the context of this war, because the main narrative now is that Russia is the aggressor. Now, Victoria, before the war started 8.5 years ago, to make the Ukrainian people pro-European instead of pro-Russian. The whole Ukrainian thinking like, well, if we're going to join the EU, we're going to be bloody rich. And the whole trick behind this is like with the money lease. For decades, Russia had to give all the Europe. This is foreign interference. If Russia tries to do anything like this, profits of their lands to America for delivering these guns, and there is this happening. It is planned for years, for decades.
30 years, but for sure, whether it's been planned for 20 on the energy side and on the economy.
So paying NGOs to manipulate our people into pro-Russian feelings, or do this in the United States. This is foreign meddling, and this would not be unacceptable. A program that the United States set up with delivering the weapons is that they don't get the weapons for free. It happened in the Second World War with supplying weapons to Russia. That meant that a dirty politics behind it that actually points its finger to
Europe. We're claiming the moral high
States that actually has been provoking this war. That is totally not up to Russia. It's not their fault. This waits ahead. What is happening now? Can you say something about this, Wyberen?
Well, I honestly, I'm not sure about. I believe our energy prices have risen by a factor 13. We're sitting around here in the cold. We can't pay our energy bills anymore. And the biggest gas field in Groningen, and we were self-supported, and we're not anymore. So, side, the United States are benefiting from this war. Russia is benefiting from this war, and Europe is crippling itself.
And we thank you.
Shot themselves completely in the foot. First, we made ourselves completely dependent on Russian gas. we close down nuclear power plants, we close down the ground, and we're not. We're just being stupid. And we've had these debates. You're welcome.
I don't mean to be facetious, but my goodness, and we're your friends. That's what friends do. Extortion.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let me just, can I say something about the war of aggression? And let's be clear right now. Russia is waging a war of aggression against Ukraine right now. War is aggressive. This isn't, songs and flowers that we're talking about right now. This is war, real war. People are dying. Things are being destroyed. Infrastructure is being destroyed. And you have to ask yourself, why? What is the objective of this conflict now for Russia? And we go back again. In December of last year, Russia presented NATO and the United States with draft treaties about a new European security framework. And NATO and the United States ignored the Russians. What the Russians were seeking, and you brought up, Victoria Nuland's $5 billion to change. Russia could care less if Ukraine joined the European Union. They don't care. Vladimir Putin has said repeatedly, you want to join the European Union? Join the European Union. But you can't join NATO. That's the red line. No NATO forces on the border with Russia and Ukraine. You have to be neutral militarily. Economically, go. In fact, Viktor Yanukovych, back in 2013, had made a decision that he was going to take advantage of that $5 billion bribe that Victoria Nuland was offering and go to the European Union. But in order to do that, he needed Russia to help them financially, to forgive debts, to help pay off things, to restructure that would cost billions of dollars. And Putin said, no, you can join the EU, but we're not going to pay for it. It's your responsibility to do this. And that's when Yanukovych said, well, we can't do this, so we have to continue with Russia. And that's what set off the Maidan demonstrations. The first Maidan demonstrations actually began, I believe, in December of 2013, and they were peaceful. Peaceful. It wasn't until February when the CIA and others came in, activated their Stepan Bandera worshiping neo-Nazi affiliated political parties in Lvov and Western Ukraine to come down and turn Maidan into a violent coup d'etat. But no, what's happening right now in Ukraine is a war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine and, frankly speaking, NATO. How else is war supposed to be defined? War isn't peaceful. War isn't pleasant. It's aggressive, and Russia is carrying out an aggressive military campaign designed to horribly expensive. And it's literally, and let's put it this way too. A lot of people forget the following, that on March 25th, the Russians announced the end of phase 1 of their operations. And they said, we are going to withdraw forces from around Kiev as a goodwill gesture to create the possibility for a negotiated settlement. And they were meeting in Istanbul, where there was everybody is acknowledged, even some Putin-hating American so-called Russian experts, Angela Stent and Fiona Hill, wrote an article about this. They said there was a real chance for peace where Russia was going to say, we're going to stop this conflict with Crimea and the Donbass. We'll return Kherson and Zaporizhia to you as long as we have a neutral Ukraine that won't join NATO. And they were getting ready to have this negotiation when NATO intervened. Now, it was Boris Johnson, but he's the prime minister of the British, who doesn't act in a vacuum. He certainly got the green light from the United States, and it was certainly coordinated within the NATO structure. He intervened and said, if you agree to this end of conflict under these terms, we can't support you with the weapons that we're promising. If you want NATO equipment, there can be no peace agreement. And so Ukraine withdrew from the peace agreement, which means now Russia is in a situation where they have to continue this conflict, this expensive conflict, this destructive conflict, this war of aggression. If you want to pretend that war isn't aggressive, I don't know what planet you live on. Anytime you wage war, it is a war of aggression, but it is not an unprovoked war of aggression. Every war is aggressive. The Ukrainians are being aggressive. The Russians are being aggressive. That's the nature of combat. So we have to be careful with the words. Yes, Russia is waging a war of aggression against Ukraine, but it's not unprovoked. And it's a war that could have been stopped back in April had Ukraine simply agreed to what today would be. Imagine today if Ukraine could stop this war with only losing Donbass and Crimea. Imagine that. But right now, Ukraine is going to lose. To destroy Russia. Remember, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, said that our goal is to bring pain to Russia, to inflict pain, to make the cost so high, to kill as many Russians as possible so that Russia will never again threaten a European country as they have threatened Ukraine. That's the goal of NATO, to inflict pain on Russia. I think it's NATO that's hurting right now, though. When I imagine what you're going, and I'm going to take the smile off my face because I am not happy that you're suffering. It's just one of these mind-boggling things that, as you said, you shot yourself in the foot. This is a self-inflicted wound. Russia did not execute an economic war against Europe. Europe executed an economic war against itself. This is purely self-inflicted, and it's just mind-boggling. What's also mind-boggling is, to be frank, the hypocrisy of the Dutch. I mean, you did agree to the sanctions, and yet now you have 91 waivers of the sanctions. Why? Because sanctions hurt you. And so you pretend to be tough against Russia, but you're really not. You waive every sanction, but you're still suffering. It's a difficult policy to explain.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. What are your ideas on the Nord Stream pipeline that was blown up?
I was just going to ask that because the famous "it's done" message.
Text, yeah. You know, I can't tell you whether it was the British Navy or the American Navy or the Polish Navy or the Dutch Navy. I don't know. What I can say is that it was a NATO-affiliated military capability that destroyed those pipelines. Now you'll say, well, Scott, do you have the proof? No, I don't. The Swedes have the proof. The Germans have the proof. The Americans have the proof. But I don't have the proof. What I have is a purely, the term would be circumstantial case. And you know what? There's people in Dutch prison right now, in American prison, who have been convicted of crimes based on circumstantial evidence that is weaker than what I'm about to present about Nord Stream. Let's start with intent. We have the President of the United States giving a verbal confession. He did so on February 7th. If a Russian tank crosses into Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 will be ended. How could you do that? A journalist said. It's German. You can't attack. It will be done. Well, there it is. That's a confession. That is literally a confession. But then we also have motive. You know, one of the things a prosecutor has to ask is, cui bono? Who benefits? Enter Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States of America. Who benefits? Instead of saying, oh my God, this is a horrible thing, a major piece of European energy infrastructure critical to the future economic health of Europe has been destroyed, he said, this is a moment of great opportunity so that we can replace Russian gas with American liquid natural gas. And as Wybren said, what's the price differential? 20 times? 20 times more expensive. Whose opportunity? America's opportunity. America benefits. Europe didn't benefit. And then lastly, means. when NATO holds a major NATO naval exercise in July and June, right over the spot where the attacks took place, and they're exercising capabilities such as unmanned underwater vehicles, demining vehicles, explosive warheads on a drone, that's like playing with the murder weapon. That's like going outside and practicing shooting the murder weapon into a stump, and there it is, the murder weapon. And it, the weapon may have disappeared, but the bullets in the stump are still there, and the bullets in the body match the bullets in the stump. The Russians went in and they say there were man-made explosives, 3 to 5 meter deep craters underneath the pipeline. What created that? What did that? No one's giving the evidence. I think the Russians have the evidence, but they haven't made it public yet. But the bottom line is the circumstantial evidence that brought to a court of law would convict the United States for the crime of blowing up the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines.
Well, Scott, what I can see is that Russia, they had a tool in their hands that could manipulate the Western European politics, that if they would stop the sanctions, they would get the gas. And if they wouldn't get any gas. But by destroying these pipelines, that leverage has gone. So it wasn't the Russians. It wasn't very smart for Russians to destroy these pipelines. It was completely stupid.
But that's not accurate, though.
Okay.
Russia never said if you stop the sanctions, we'll deliver gas. Russia has been delivering gas despite the sanctions. The only time the gas got turned off is when the West violated the contracts. Russia is and has always been a reliable supplier of energy. But when the West seizes hundreds of billions of dollars of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, steals it, and then insists that Russia continue to accept dollars and euros for a contract, knowing that Russia will never receive that money, that's a violation of the contract. So Russia said, we'll continue to supply gas, but you have to pay in rubles. And the West said, we won't pay in rubles. And then Russia said, well, then you won't get gas. You don't get nothing for free. But what Russia has said all along, it wasn't Russia that turned off the switch on Nord Stream 1. It was the West sanctioning Russia, preventing Siemens from providing repairs to turbines on the pipeline. It wasn't Russia that turned off the switch to Nord Stream 2. It was the West that turned it off. All Russia said is, if you need gas, turn it on. There were no conditions attached saying you must lift sanctions, you must surrender. It was, if you need gas, turn on the switch and pay us in rubles. And Germany was getting ready to do just that when the United States took the option off the table by blowing up the pipelines.
Wyberen, so who do you think that destroyed these pipelines? Because Russia didn't have a good reason to do this, and the West has actually, as Scott said, even promised to do this. So, because these are serious allegations, if the United States destroyed these pipelines, these are supposedly our friends. If it's the English who did this, or some NATO party, or in the exercise they have been doing this, what is the implications? Is this a war to provoke the anger of the people of the Western countries to start a bigger war? Or is it to destroy our economies? I mean, what are the implications of this destroying our fossil fuel supply, cheap fossil fuel supply? It's unprecedented, and it's unbelievable. Oh, we horen weer geen geluid, Wyberen.
Well, while he's waiting to do that, one of the things I'm curious of from a Dutch perspective, because I'm an American, so I'm sitting long distance. I observe things, but I don't live things. What is the impact of high energy costs on Dutch industry? I mean, because if you have to pay 20 times the price for your energy, can you stay in business? Are Dutch businesses able to earn a profit? Are they going to go out of business? And is this a pattern that we're going to? We know, for instance, in France, the world famous Durex glass company has shut down for 5 months because they can't afford to stay in business. We know in Germany, aluminum smelters have to shut down because they can't afford to pay the price of the gas necessarily to run the smelters. It's the same thing happening in the Netherlands.
Yeah, there's many Dutch bakeries, factories have closed down because of the prices. We have a very big glass house industry that is growing flowers and vegetables. That is, from many ways, that they're being attacked. It's not only because the gas price, because the heating in the glass houses is with the Dutch, used to be with the Dutch gas, and now it was Russian gas because we shut down our gas supply because of earthquakes in Groningen. And the Russian gas is gone, and now I heard that they're changing the type of flour so they don't need too much heating. And but they're trying to survive. But it's the economy is being destroyed. Certain parts of our economy are having a very difficult time, or just they have to close down. They're closing down.
So where's your tax base coming from? I mean, here it is. The Netherlands are sitting there promising to support Ukraine, promising this, promising that, promising this. Where's the money coming from? The Dutch economy, if it's not working, where's the money coming from?
The last 10, 15 years, I'm thinking, like, where's all the intelligence gone? Because if you see all these patterns, it's about destroying our own economy. It's not about solving problems. There's no intelligence in all this decision making in our government, none at all. You know, it's only hurting us. And you can only think like, okay, maybe this is the aim. Because if this is not the aim, how can you do such stupid things?
Can the Dutch people demand a snap election? Can there be a vote of no confidence? At what point in time did the Dutch people get to stand up and say, enough is enough, you're hurting us, we need new politicians?
You maybe know something about the farmer demonstrations here in Holland, and they're growing. Then it's diminishing again, and then it's popping up again. We don't have a very reactive population. We've been a bit liberal. I've been in the last big protest. I was 17. We had 550,000 people on the street demonstrating against the cruise missiles in that time. And since then, because they still came, we lost any confidence that demonstration would help. So the rising up of the people is not happening, where everybody is just opportunistic, trying to survive with their own family and their own businesses. And the farmers are being destroyed because of the nitrogen problem. It's the fertilizer, it's the cow dung, and so only to save a few plants that live somewhere else in Europe very well, but they have to live here in Holland also. So they're destroying an industry which is one of the highest advanced industries in the world. And it's a madhouse, Scott. It's a madhouse.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a bit of an echo, Wyberen.
No, it's frustrating as an American to, especially someone like myself who has spent a considerable amount of time in the Netherlands, seeing what a wonderful country it is, wonderful people, advanced country, and then to watch it flounder like this. It's very frustrating because, you know, I mean, every Dutch person understands the history. You know, we fought side by side as brothers in World War II, and we've been allies ever since. And to sit there and watch a friend, an ally, suffer like this is it's painful.
Scott, the amount of disinformation in the media has reached a point that there's a lot of echo, Wyberen. Immense echo.
I can't change microphones while recording, so if you stop my recording for a minute, I can change to my headset.
What should I do?
Stop recording for a second and he'll...
Okay. Okay, Scott, we'll start again. Sorry, Wyberen van Haga just left because of technical errors. Scott, I want to mention I've seen you with different people coming back in the podcast, And I thought, like, wow, that would be great if it could happen with the Dutch, the Dutch also, the Dutch connection. I would like to try to get different guests in our podcast, so to get a different perspective. I really thought it was very courageous of Wyberen as a politician, Dutch politician, to be in a podcast together with you and with me, because everybody who is they put character assassinations on like yourself and on Wyberen on me. It's we are some kind of outcast, so we can sit together. About what we're talking about. This is by the Dutch. I have a story to tell you. I was on vacation in Portugal a few months ago, and there was a couple with kids that came from Israel. And I'm always very careful to talk to these people, because Israel is it's a dangerous place to mention any criticism. They can be getting very fiery about how Israel came to existence, or the treatment of Palestinians and stuff like that. But so I've been slowly trying to see where these people came from and what I could actually discuss with them. And they were kind of liberal thinking in a way, like, okay, they had quite a lot of criticism on the Israeli politics also. And I asked them, how is it possible that the IDF is training Nazis in Ukraine? You know, how do you feel about that? Yeah. And to my surprise, this couple was in Portugal to find a new place to live. They wanted to leave Israel because the IDF is training Nazis. Yes? This is, for me, I was very happy that there are such sincere people around that actually say, okay, you know, this is unacceptable for us. We are going to leave Israel if they're doing this. But this is what is happening. The world seems to be gone completely crazy. Not everything that you thought of. We had some thought. You said the Americans and the Dutch fought together against the Nazis, you know. But somehow now these Nazis are our allies in Ukraine. Yeah, these Bandera types. You know that when you read the stories that the special forces, that the SS, they came out of that. The Polish, that they put women and children on the tanks to protect themselves, trying to destroy the Polish uprising. You know, these thugs, these Machiavellian madmen, you know, racists, they are our allies.
Yeah, you know, it's frustrating as an American. We just, last April 28th, we have a well-known American congressman, Jamie Raskin. He's a Democrat from Maryland. He's Jewish. And on April 28th, he tweeted out, Holocaust Remembrance Day. He said, you know, we need to, and of course, I 100% support that tweet. We have to, never again, we can never allow this to happen again. But then he goes on the floor of the U.S. Congress and he says, and he chastises his Republican counterpart, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was raising questions about the billions of dollars we were ready to send to Ukraine. She said, you're sending American taxpayer money to arm and train Nazis. And Raskin stood up and said, where is the proof? Where is the evidence? How dare you? He forgot that just simply 2 years ago, he voted in favor of an amendment to the Defense Appropriation Act, which forbids U.S. taxpayer money to be used to train the Azov Battalion. Why? Because it's a white supremacist neo-Nazi organization. He signed a letter to then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo demanding that the Azov Battalion be put on the foreign terrorist organization list because of their white supremacist neo-Nazi attitude. Jamie Raskin knows the truth, but because now politically we've decided that it's okay to support the Nazis because they're killing Russians, he pretends they don't exist. The U.S. Congress just invited 4 Azov Nazis to Congress in the People's House, where they were treated like heroes, given a hero's welcome. They were allowed to auction off memorabilia, patches with Nazi symbology, in the People's House to raise $30,000 to support their cause. They're now doing a tour of the United States to places like Stanford University, where they're treated like heroes. So we have just forgotten history. We forget that these people worship a man named Stepan Bandera, who committed horrific crimes against Jewish people, Polish people, Russian people. 60 miles away from my home here in the United States, there's something called Heroes Park. And every year, Heroes Park hosts these summer camps where they indoctrinate Ukrainian American children into Nazi ideology. They have a monument with the statues of Stepan Bandera and 3 other Nazi-affiliated Ukrainian nationalists, and they hold parades wearing the brown uniform of the SS, where they put up the Sieg Heil salute. This is in the United States that we do this. Normally, you'd want to condemn this, but now they're heroes. Now they're being paraded around in the Congress, and nobody tells the truth about what their origins are. It's just, it's mind-boggling, mind-boggling.
There have been discussions also in the Dutch parliament about the Nazis in Ukraine, and they've been dismissed. There were a few thousand of these guys, and that the military battalions that consist of these Nazis were insignificant. Could you tell something about how many are there of these Nazis, and how is their political and military influence within Ukraine?
Well, I think people conflate the political parties, the right sector, Sloboda, and other right-wing Bandera worshipping political parties, who have a minority support. I mean, 12% maybe they can get, less than that, of the vote. But these guys and their leaders have bragged and said it's not about how many people support us, it's how many people fear us. Because it's not about winning the election, it's about intimidating the others to do what we demand you do, or else we will, and they say this straight up, we will Maidan you. They brag about what they did at Maidan. They brag about the violence they brought in. They brag about what they accomplished. They have threatened every president of Ukraine since 2014 with a Maidan if they do anything that deviates from the policies they want. So yes, they're a political minority, but their influence is massive because of the violence they bring to bear on Ukrainian politics. This violence is brought out by the Azov battalion. Now, we use the term battalion. And in the West, that means, about 500-600 guys? No, the Azov battalion is 30,000 people. There's also the Aidar battalion, another 15 to 20,000 people. There's the Kraken battalion. I can go on and on and on. The Kraken battalion right now, they have their tanks and they paint the swastika on their tanks. They are proud of their Nazi affiliation. And these are mainstream frontline Ukrainian forces that are, waging the conflict in eastern Ukraine. So to pretend that they're minor, what's happened is there was a problem with propaganda in the West because prior to this conflict, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post all ran headline stories saying Ukraine has a Nazi problem. But then Russia and Ukraine went to war, and suddenly Russia's the enemy. So they've rehabilitated the Nazis. The Nazis no longer publicly go around and do this, except they do. People didn't see the Ukrainian paratroopers upon graduation singing a song glorifying Stepan Bandera. This just happened a month ago. They don't see the people gathering together in Lvov with Nazi memorabilia, doing the Sieg Heil, when a soldier of these units dies in combat, they're buried in a ceremony where the people bearing the coffin to the grave are wearing the uniform of the Waffen SS. The Nazis are real. They're there. And if you say there aren't, then you're deliberately blind and you're deliberately addling your brain. You're ignoring the fact.
But what you're saying actually is that the population of Ukraine is being hostage by this 12% Nazis that are living in Ukraine.
Yes, first of all, not every Ukrainian's a Nazi. But let me put it this way. In the United States, not everybody's a member of the Ku Klux Klan. But if you allow the Ku Klux Klan to intimidate politicians, to pass laws about segregation that demean the blacks, diminish the blacks, then you are literally doing the work of the Ku Klux Klan. Not every Ukrainian is a member of these right-wing Nazi parties, but they sit back and allow their elected officials to be intimidated into passing legislation that elevates Stepan Bandera to a national hero, to rename a street in Kiev Stepan Bandera Avenue, to raise monuments to Stepan Bandera, and to allow the Azov Battalion and other right-wing thugs to threaten to hang a Ukrainian president by the neck in the streets of Kiev if he dares act in a fashion that deviates from the policies that the Nazis insist on. Policies that I mentioned before treat the Russians like the Germans treated Jews.
So, just going back a little bit in time, the 8 years of war that was happening between the Donbass and the Kiev regime, the mention is about 13,000 people died. And in these numbers, you've seen the street with all the pictures of the children in the Donbass that died because of the shelling, where also these Nazi battalions were hard to stop. There's been talk about the president trying to retain these battalions from shooting the civilians in the Donbass. The 13,000 plus people that died, how many of these 13,000 were actually Ukrainians on the Kiev side, and how many were military on the Donbass side, and how many were civilians?
Of the civilians, I think the number of civilians is roughly a little bit more than 50%. So of that number, about 50% are civilians. The other casualties, you can break it down, I think, 60-40, meaning 60% of the remaining casualties were Ukrainian casualties, 40% were the Donbass casualties. But the vast majority of the people killed are not vast, but the majority of the people killed were civilians. But there were significant military losses as well on both sides.
Yeah. So what you see is that the military of Ukraine is shelling the population, cities, villages, shooting at flats, residential areas. They're parking they're setting up their tanks and their mortars in the residential areas. But on the Western television, you see only Russia being blamed for the damages, the mass graves of civilians that are being found. What is happening here? Is the Western media completely lying? Is it Ukraine who is actually shooting their own civilians?
Well, we know, for instance, the Washington Post and I believe Amnesty International or another humanitarian group have done reports where they say straight up that the Ukrainians use the Ukrainian civilian population as human shields in violation of international humanitarian law. It's not me saying this. It's not Russian state media saying this. It's the Washington Post and Amnesty International. Why? Because Human Rights Watch is the group, I think, too. Because it's so obvious. You can't ignore the fact that the Ukrainians dig into residential areas. And, for instance, the battle for Mariupol, the Azov Battalion would deliberately fortify an apartment block, keeping dozens of civilians hostage in the basement, knowing that Russia wouldn't destroy the apartment block because they know the Russians are actually complying with international humanitarian law and not deliberately targeting civilians. So then the Russians do things such as sacrifice the lives of their men to fight to the building, to evacuate the civilians from the building before engaging to destroy the enemy. But nobody tells that story except in Russia. But in the West, oh, that's Russian propaganda. No, it's documented fact. And the same thing with the ongoing struggle. Ask yourself why the Russians evacuated close to 200,000 people from Kherson. If the Russians were the Ukrainians, they would have kept the civilians there, dug in there, and made the Ukrainians fight street by street, slaughtering civilians. That's not how Russia fights. Russia evacuated the people and then withdrew. Russia does not deliberately target civilians. There are of course, civilian casualties in conflict. There always are. But most, for instance, in Bucha, the Kiev north, the suburb north of Kiev, the vast majority of the civilians that are found in these so-called mass graves are civilians that were killed by Ukrainian artillery fire. It was Ukraine firing artillery into the populated areas, and then these bodies being placed in a mass grave because they were rotting in the streets. And now the Ukrainian authorities come in, dig up the graves, and say, see, this is proof that Russia executed these people. No, it's not. It's proof that the Ukrainian military killed its own civilians, which they target deliberately all the time.
Yeah, so the Ukrainian side is never mentioned actually in our news, in our press. It's only the Western narrative, the NATO narrative, trying to prove that Russia is the bad guy. The press, there's been very old stories that it's controlled by the CIA. You have been subject to how the press is dealing with you. I have been subject to this. What do you think? What's happening here? Who controls this? The press is supposed to control the powers or check the powers to protect the people of the world, and they're not doing this anymore. So what is happening?
In the old days, the CIA, MI6 would always go around the foreign press, and they'd buy an editor or a reporter who could then be used to plant stories in the media to influence people. In their own countries, the CIA would have friendly sources in the media that they could pick up the phone and call and leak a story here, leak a story there. But the media, by and large, was independent. That's why we could report on Watergate. That's why Seymour Hersh could report on My Lai, etc. But the media now has been captured by commercial interests, and it's all about making money. It's no longer about reporting and telling the truth. It's about the bottom line, making money. And in order to make money, you have to entertain. And in order to entertain, you can't be explaining things. You just have to be telling a story. And the best way to tell the most dramatic story is to repeat the information being put out by governments. So the media has become nothing more than a stenographer of propaganda. It's not about the truth. If it was about the truth, they'd at least read the Russian side, do a research into it, find out where the Russians are correct, and report that as well as sort of a counter narrative. The United States says this, Russia says this, let the reader decide. But instead, they suppress everything about the Russian narrative. They only put down what the government says, and then they attack anybody who dares question this as an information terrorist, as a war criminal, as a Russian propagandist. And then in the United States, we give the Ukrainians money to create centers of countering disinformation, Orwellian in its title, who publish blacklists targeting Americans who are like me, who are exercising their free speech. And then they take that same list and they turn it over to the Ukrainian intelligence services, a list known as the Mirotvorets list, the peacemaker list. And the people on that list are targeted for assassination. I'm on that list. And it's not hypothetical. People on that list have been murdered by the Ukrainian intelligence service. The most notable recently is Daria Dugina, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, not a Russian general, not a Russian politician, a philosopher. And they killed her because they didn't like her father's thinking. The thought police have taken over. And the United States is funding this to target American citizens. That's how sick this has become. And the media knows this is happening, says nothing, because the media is no longer independent.
On that hit list, Chris Hedges and Glenn Greenwald are there. John Marsheimer, Pink Floyd singer Roger Waters, that you had a internet meeting with just recently. You just posted on your Twitter and your Telegram account. Rand Paul, the senator, is on that. Tulsi Gabbard and Edward Luttwak, and many others, inclusive a Dutch woman who is walking around in Russia as a freelancer or an independent journalist. They're all been put on this hit list. Now, this hit list, supposedly they had also the addresses of the people, and some people already have been killed. Now, Euronet, our Dutch government is not been mentioning anything about this, while there's one Dutch citizen actually on that list. How serious should we take this hit list?
People die, so it should be taken seriously. People on the list are being killed. The Ukrainians brag about it. They put a red circle with a line through it over Daria Dugina's face and wrote "liquidated," as if they were bragging about killing somebody on this list. And the United States has said straight up it was the Ukrainian intelligence service that killed her. So we know the list is run by the Ukrainian intelligence service, and we know the Ukrainian intelligence service is actively seeking out people and killing them on the list. How worried should I be? Well, in the United States right now, we have an atmosphere conducive to political violence. Political violence occurs all the time. And we have guns that are being used. And as I said, 60 miles away from me is Ellenville, New York, where the neo-Nazis thrive. Now, the U.S. government has paid the Ukrainian government to create a list that has my name on it, targeted me for assassination, and has done nothing to stop it. In fact, they encourage it. And so if you're a neo-Nazi thug in Ellenville, New York, you're looking at this list and you're saying the U.S. government isn't stopping this. Maybe this is a green light. Maybe the U.S. government is telling me, kill this guy. The only way to stop this is for the U.S. government to come out straight out and say this list is an abomination. It's a criminal act. It must stop. Ukraine cannot be doing this. You cannot target American citizens or any citizens. They have to condemn this list, shut this list down, and let anybody know that anybody who acts on this list will be treated as a terrorist, a criminal, and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Because unless the U.S. government does that, people are going to die.
It's incredible that the American government's actually paying these organizations that are creating a list and putting it online. It's not. I hope with this video, some people will start asking questions in the Dutch government. Why there is this Dutch woman on the list? I can't find her name at the moment. She has been in Moscow and walking around in Russia for some time now. Yeah, Scott. I've been following you for more than a year now, I think, and the situation is dire. It seems that the press is not doing its job. We are getting it from crisis into crisis, and I'm seeing you. You're just standing there, and you don't get intimidated. You don't feel intimidated. You just keep on sharing the information, and you're getting a wider group of people listening to you. It's growing bigger and bigger every day. But where is it going to end? What is going to end this madness? Yeah, this is it's not about only about the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is one of the many steps in insanity that's happening. It's a bit. You mentioned in one of the videos that the Orthodox and the nature of Russia and the LGBTQ mental sexual behavior, that Putin actually said there's no religion on earth ever been promoting this kind of sexual behavior. It's unnatural. It's I think even Putin said it's satanic. It's a cultural war. There is something else happening beside this land grab or looking for fossil fuel or minerals. The wars that are normally about, like the Iraq war, was about oil. So there is another dimension to this war in this world. Can you say something about this?
Well, I mean, I think what Putin said was that that Russia is not going to allow people to impose their cultural beliefs on Russia. That Russia is a nation that is founded in, Orthodox Christianity, and it embraces traditional family values where a man is a man, a woman is a woman, and a family is a union of a man and a woman. But he also said that Russia doesn't care what other nations do in their own countries. So in order to have a war, Russia would have to be trying to impose its will on the West. That's not happening. It's the West trying to impose its will on Russia. So Russia is resisting that. But to say that this is now a cultural war between Russia and the West, only one side is fighting. And frankly speaking, this is a very shallow representation of what's going on, because if you strip away the economy and the political empowerment that an economy brings, I don't think too many people are going to be marching in the streets supporting LGBTQ rights. They're going to be talking about how we get fed, how we get heat, how we survive. So this is the real part of the conflict here. Nations that are not hungry, nations that have jobs, that have heat, they have the luxury to be woke. But nations that are starving, that are freezing, that are unemployed, desperate, they don't embrace the woke. They embrace survival. And I think Europe is going to be struggling to survive in the coming months. So how does this end? Again, I go back to December of 2021, when Russia put forward its plan for a European security framework. If you read that plan, Russia wasn't asking Europe to surrender. Russia is seeking a European security framework that isn't dictated by or doesn't mandate a Russian victory over Europe. It does require Ukraine to be neutral, denazified, and demilitarized. So there is a military component to this, but when this war ends, and it will end in a Russian victory, the question is, where is Europe going to be? And I believe that it's in Russia's interest for Europe to have a soft landing. Russia's not trying to destroy Europe. They're not trying to defeat Europe. They're trying to actually help Europe from killing itself. Because ultimately, what Russia needs is the ability for Russia and Europe to peacefully coexist in a mutually beneficial manner. Russia's not seeking to defeat Europe, occupy Europe, destroy Europe. Russia just wants to live in peace with Europe, but it cannot tolerate when Europe, working with the United States, is trying to destabilize Russia by stripping Ukraine out of its sphere of influence and turning Ukraine into a NATO, nation. So, how does this end? It ends with a Russian military victory and Europe being mature enough to understand that it needs to work with Russia in a new context of no.
The sound, there's something happening with the sound. I hear only noises. I can't hear you anymore. It's really disturbing. I have no idea what is happening, Scott. I don't know if you can hear me. I only hear mechanical sounds at the moment.
Hier zo'n sticker liggen van Tilasmi.
Ja, fantastisch.
Zegt alles.
Ja.
Dit is hem.
Ja.
Ook een goede sticker.
Ik vond het te veel commercial voor de NOS om hem op de microfoons te plakken.
Ja, nou,
Zijn we bedoel?
Ja, dat is het. Het wordt nog druk op de bumper van uw auto, want er moeten allerlei stickers op. Want wij gaan stickers blijven produceren. Ja. U heeft straks zo'n gouden schildpad heeft u erop zitten. U heeft NOS is fake news. Weet je waarom? Je moet elkaar maar herkennen. Want dan weet je tenminste wie je een hand kan geven.